Hello and welcome to the Peace Talk, this time with a special guest, James Muldoon. He's a senior lecturer in political science at the University of Exeter and head of digital research at the think tank called Autonomy. His latest work is on the politics of digital technology and how we can recover forgotten ideas from the past to help us rethink our digital future. In this regard, he makes strong arguments for council democracy and platform socialism. His non-academic writing has appeared in several journals and articles like The Guardian, Time Magazine, Sydney Morning Herald, Huffington Post, Jacobin, and so on and so forth. I'm very glad and honored that you found the time for this talk.
Well, thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be on the in the talk.
So before we get deeper into your work and political philosophy, I would like to ask you some personal questions. It seems that throughout your whole writings and through your books and articles, I can feel and see and even, I can even feel and touch it, the how can I say, the spirit, the drive to democratize democracy. So what is the reason for it? Maybe before we get into this question, two other related questions to this: what motivated you to study in general, and did you have any academic role models?
Okay, well, I think I can try and spin all those together. One of the earliest things that motivated me to start writing on democracy was I picked up a book from Hannah Arendt when I was backpacking in Costa Rica. It's a very odd story. I was trying to learn Spanish, and so I went into a secondhand bookshop, and I saw a little English language section. Spanish was very hard at the time, so I was like, okay, I'll give myself a little break from Spanish. I'll get an English book, and I saw a book by Hannah Arendt. They're called Between Past and Future. And it's like a collection of essays. And I was a law student at the time. I was like second year law. I had taken a year off my study, as was very common at the time in Australia. And I was just so fascinated by this book. It really opened my world up to all of this European philosophy that I hadn't been studying as part of my law degree. And it really completely changed the track of my entire study. So I did finish my law degree, but I kind of hated every moment of it at the end. It was so boring compared to philosophy. I'd be sitting in the law lectures, listening to property law and constitutional law, and I was just reading philosophy in my, while I was doing it. So I got through it, but my life had changed so much. And I was just, from about, the age of 21, I just became absolutely obsessed with philosophy. It's like all I would think about, all I would talk about, all I would do. I made all these little charts and diagrams all over my room. This is still in a kind of analog era where, I was just handwriting notes, and it looked like I was a psychopath plotting my next set of serial killings. So yeah, that was a huge kind of turning point for me. And in the end, I did a year abroad in France after that. And I had a lecturer there called Olivier Rouchet, who was very influential over me because he was a very big fan of Arendt too. And I ended up writing an undergraduate essay for him on Hannah Arendt and the council system, which was kind of like my earliest work that was like received some kind of attention. And it was kind of my first couple of journal articles. And I ended up doing my PhD on Hannah Arendt and council democracy. So the whole journey on, as you said, democratizing democracy, as it were, or spreading the principles of democracy from a narrow political sphere to broader spheres of social life, kind of began from an Arendtian mindset. And Olivier Rouchet was kind of an early mentor of mine and believed in me and gave me the confidence to kind of articulate my ideas and challenge me and helped me in that kind of very strict French academic, system. But at the same time, he had kind of spent a year in Berkeley. And so he was this kind of American-French hybrid scholar who had tried to absorb the best of both systems. And so I learned a lot from him early on. And then coming back to Melbourne, there was a number of scholars around an institution called the Melbourne School of Continental Philosophy that were also very influential over me. And they were all like maybe 5-10 years older than me at the time. People like John Rofe, Jessica White, Justin Clemens, this kind of people in the Melbourne Continental Philosophy circles, basically. And I would attend a lot of their lectures, and I kind of learned all of my Deleuze and Foucault and various French philosophy from them. And I just manically writing notes on everything. So yeah, this was the kind of early days when I was still doing my master's degree and PhD. And Arendt was always there, right, in the background. And I think the big turning point for me in this kind of coming to terms with her thought and, you know, other aspects of European philosophy was really doing more historical research on instances of council democracy, right? So we can turn to various workers' movements, essentially, from, let's say, the Paris Commune, although you might want to go back to the French Revolution, but let's say the Paris Commune kind of onwards into the Russian and German revolutions. And it was only when I kind of did a little bit of archival work, I started reading also some of the secondary sources in the historical literature, that I started to question more and more about Arendt's interpretation of this. And so my PhD thesis was really a kind of critique of Arendt and her views on council democracy from a socialist perspective and from a more historically grounded perspective of the workers' movement. And I really think some of my best work on Arendt is this kind of very fine-grained kind of historical line-by-line reading of her work, and just showing both how indebted she is to the European workers' movement, how much she draws from it, but also how distorted it gets within her interpretive lens, and how much she imputes her own kind of political ontological categories onto this, and how that influences her views of council democracy. So I think what I've come out of that is an appreciation for how democracy could become more participatory, but also some of the socioeconomic realities of what would need to be done in terms of, well, from my perspective, from overturning capitalist relations of production and replacing them with a more cooperative kind of system. So yeah, that kind of, I touched upon a lot of your, you know, questions there. I think I've given you a little intro to my biography, so hopefully that works.
Yeah, very interesting. To be honest, I admire people who gets obsessed with their work, and especially if they are in the field of politics and political philosophy. Yeah, it's quite amazing how much you published, and like we said now, you wrote and thought about Hannah Arendt, and this was actually one of my questions to you, because like we said, you wrote not only about Hannah Arendt, but also on Machiavelli, and for example, the Essex School of Political Thought, post-Marxist, Lacan and Chantal Mouffe, for example, or nowadays Oliver Mahat, they refer to Machiavelli and Hannah Arendt, and they are also mentioning this socialist kind of republicanism, and you also write on this. So maybe we start from here. What do you mean, or what is the main characteristics of this socialist republicanism? Because many times Machiavelli is seen as the bad guy who want to tell us, okay, everything is power and we need power politics, and then suddenly this Essex School of Political Thought teaches us that, okay, we can read Machiavelli in a different way.
Yeah, so I do have a review essay on Machiavelli and some of the prominent interpretive schools. I can't remember who the exact, I think it was John McCormick, Philip Pettit, and Miguel Vata. And I reviewed through 3 of their books, all kind of giving us a very different take on Machiavelli and the kind of republicanism that we should take from his work. I think by now I have a much more negative, not negative, but much more critical view of Machiavelli and Machiavelli-inspired work. My own kind of brand of socialist republicanism, both the historical work that I've done on it and the kind of contemporary political, philosophical implications that I draw from it is much more inspired by later German thinkers, in particular, Karl Kautsky and Rosa Luxemburg. So this is really attached to my research that I did on council democracy, kind of thinking about, how we can historicize Arendt's interpretation. And what I did there was I looked to a series of thinkers within the German Social Democratic Party, people for whom republicanism was an agreed shared starting point for what a political program should look like, right? So this is kind of in a transitionary period in the late 19th and early 20th century, when republicanism was kind of slowly getting supplanted by socialism as the dominant left-wing tendency and left-wing political ideology at the time. So, in the early 19th century, we're talking about the kind of 1830s and 40s, for example, radical forms of republicanism in continental Europe are basically like the leading progressive force at the time, right? It's anti-monarchical. It's got some kind of theory of non-domination, of active citizens. It's something that is really animating a lot of the political movements at the time. I'll link back to how Machiavelli fits into this in just a second, but it's really kind of in the later half of the 19th century that a lot of the universalism of this gets called into question, and people become much more concerned with economic considerations, right? So how does the Republican ideology incorporate these new kind of critiques of socioeconomic life, of factory labor, of capitalism? How do we join these concerns for becoming an equal citizen, sharing in the kind of active civic life? How do we join those with concerns about wage labor, with concerns about domination experienced in the workplace? And so these kinds of more economic focused Republican ideologies and radical republicanism slowly becomes a more hybrid ideology, right? And so I think, you hear people like Karl Kautsky in the early 20th century talking about the necessity of creating a socialist republic, a republic which is to say a nation state bounded by laws, and with a universal suffrage and active citizenry, and a kind of basic parliamentary institutions. How do you combine that with a form of socialization over economic production? So how do you socialize economic life while still maintaining a certain political institutions of a republic? It became important in the past kind of 5 or 10 years because socialists were more interested, or became more interested in what the political institutions might look like in a post-capitalist society. So I think it kind of achieves a second life, as it were, more recently, when people that were inspired by Quentin Skinner and Philip Pettit, there's kind of a new generation that comes that are much more socialist in ideology and are much more concerned with what happens after the kind of traditional story that Republicans tell, which tends to kind of close off in the 19th century. Many of them are inspired by Alex Gurevich, right? Who is, I think he's at Brown now, but writes on the Knights of Labor, which is like an American radical Republican movement at the late 19th century. So there's kind of a lot of mini Gureviches running around doing this kind of socialist republicanism. I guess I would probably be one of these people, or I'm in the milieu, as it were. But for me, it's really the German Social Democratic Party that's, inspired me most in terms of my own, version of socialist republicanism. Machiavelli is interesting because he's such a big influence on some of these people. So there's a kind of a bit of a difference between a more Machiavellian inspired school and then people that are much more interested in figures in America and the UK, right? So the Machiavellian democracy, for example, John McCormack, Camille Vergara is also more interested in this kind of Machiavellian inspired work. I know it's very big in certain types of post-Marxism. I guess I can see the appeal, But I think, Machiavelli's theory of class conflict, I don't think is very suitable to an understanding of how class difference operates today. I think we don't need to go back before Marx. If anything, we need to start from Marx and then update a whole bunch of things related to, Eurocentrism and social reproduction theory and a whole variety of things. Basically just building on some of the analysis that we have from Marx and Engels. I think this idea that we would go back to a Machiavellian theory where there are two classes, there's like an oligarchy and nobility, and they just want to oppress, and then there's this kind of peasant class that we don't hear much about in Machiavelli's The Prince, but comes to the fore more in the discourses. To me, that's just not giving you as much meat on the bones as Marx's theory of class analysis does. So I think, to my mind, a lot of theories that come out of that tend to become quite ontologized as well, that we just get these distinctions that exist in Machiavelli's work, and then they're kind of just thrown onto reality, basically, that there's like X and Y, and it becomes lots of dualisms. I don't find that as helpful as some of the more historical stuff from the Marxist and post-Marxist tradition. So I think I definitely count myself within that genre, more broadly understood, but perhaps slightly more critical of some of the Machiavellian work as I may have been, maybe 10 years ago.
Yeah, I agree. And what I get from republicanism in this sense, not in the sense of Trump or the Republican Party, is many things. For example, from Hannah Arendt, I draw the term to have courage. In order to make politics, you have to be courageous and to do something, to be active, vita activa. So you have to be active and to participate in the society. So this is important. What I don't like in Hannah Arendt, for example, is the thing that she wrote about that in order to make politics, you have to have a lot of free time. And so the sphere of economy, and so to speak, the oikos is for poor people, and so therefore they cannot make politics. So it's like an elitarian approach to politics. It on the basic level, it is true, but how can we democratize democracy in this sense so that everybody can participate in democracy? That's the question that I was asking Hannah Arendt in this sense. And also this sense of vita activa you get from Machiavelli. So you have to do something, not only to write about and do a great philosophy. You have to do something in order to change. But you can find it in Marx as well. So yeah, it's nothing new. Let's move on to the next question. You wrote and thought about the platform socialism. What is the term platform socialism? And maybe before we get deeper into this, is socialism a term that is useful for left-wing ideas and left-wing politics? Because it's this ambiguity, the past, and it's a label that is also it has a long history, let it put it like this. So what are your thoughts?
We started off in a very biographical grain, so I'll continue along that journey. Once I was finished working on the kind of Kautsky, Luxemburg, social democracy tradition, I started turning to how we might be able to translate some of these ideas into the present, in particular, thinking about how they might apply to the world of technology and digital platforms. What really struck me was that so much of what was then called the socialization debates that were happening at the turn of the century in terms of how industries and large enterprises might be brought under social ownership, particularly while the German Revolution and the Russian revolutions were happening. There was an ongoing debate as to how they might effectively be implemented in other parts of Europe. What would that look like in practice? Who would own it? Who would govern it? What kinds of worker participation would be possible, and how would the system meet basic human needs in terms of economic production. So these debates, which were very much alive within the German Social Democratic Party, really shed a lot of light on what we might do today in terms of some of the digital platforms. So I started the project Platform Socialism as a way of reimagining what the internet could look like today and what kinds of ownership and governance structures we might like to institute over digital platforms today, from Meta and Airbnb to Uber and Deliveroo. So there was a fairly widespread idea at the time that the best thing we could do was to fix Facebook, was to engage in some kind of, regulatory reforms, maybe make some laws about the limits that they could kind of work within. Maybe we might even set limits on how big they could grow, how many users they could have, what their market capitalization could be. But I found these to be a little too piecemeal for what was actually the problem, right? From about 2015 onwards, there was a real widespread idea that something had gone wrong with how technology was being developed, that what was seen as a force for good in the early 2010s, when we had things like the Twitter revolutions and, people thought the internet would bring down dictators and we would live in a more open and transparent world. Suddenly, the huge tech platforms owned half of everything. They controlled information flows. They were gatekeepers to large marketplaces. And they started to, use their power in very insidious and very problematic ways, to say the least. So we had the data breaches, we had kind of Trump getting elected, there was the scandal around Russia. A lot was going, and there was a huge shift within the world and how we all talked about tech. So in light of some of these concerns, platform socialism was a way of uniting some of the different voices that we were beginning to hear about tech, both shifting the conversation into a more fundamental terrain where questions of power, ownership, and control were central, rather than questions like privacy breaches or individual property rights. I think we needed to turn to what was really going on with these platforms. And I think to properly understand it, we need to turn to the political economy, to what kind of markets that they were engaged in, what their ownership structure was, whose interests did they serve, and who actually had, the final say in a lot of this. And if you look, for example, at a company like Meta or then Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg individually has almost unilateral control over the company because he owns a special class of shares, Class B shares, that give him overwhelming voting rights within the company, such that it would be very, very difficult for any collection of shareholders to ever have their say over his. And I think you can actually kind of see that in the recent turn towards the metaverse and how it's been rolled out. I remember watching the launch event and just thinking that it was so corny and so cheesy, and the very idea of what the metaverse would look like, the images, the kind of various robots and people floating around this room playing cards. You really wonder how on earth anyone thought that was going to be a really good set. Who would get excited about something like that? Because it just already seemed lame and passé and out of date. That was like your grandfather was trying to sell you a new version of the internet. So it could only be, from the mind of Zuck that something like that would feel like a good idea. And I just feel like the fact that he has so much power at that company is demonstrated by these silly products that get put out. Because I just don't think anyone can say no to him anymore, essentially. If he has his heart set on something, I think you just basically have to enact the vision or get moved out of the way. So I think this is a big problem at a lot of these companies because it's about a few select billionaires having almost complete control over essential communication infrastructure, over digital services that we rely upon for emails, messaging, notification services. but also this whole much wider variety of social life, from short-term rental accommodation to how we meet our friends, how we eat food, how we get places. It's just the digital economy, it really has bled out into many, many other sectors in the economy, from transportation to food and housing and communication. So there's just, it affects so much of our everyday lives. And, you know, within this framework, I think what the fundamental question that platform socialism asks is who controls the platforms, how are they organized, and whose interests do they serve? And it calls for a new form of social ownership over digital platforms, such that communities of various sizes, from very small local communities right up to international networks, can establish new forms of ownership and control over platforms. And the real point that I'm making in this book is that it can't be a one-size-fits-all kind of model. So the contribution that I make is thinking about how we can imagine a broader ecosystem of different sized platforms, looking to the function that the platform performs in order to tell us something about the kinds of community that might be involved in its governance. So there are many geographically based platform services that might be run by workers' co-ops, for example. We could look to municipal governments to run slightly larger services with more expensive infrastructure and more need for public authorities in how they operate. And, you know, finally, we can move up to the national and international scale, where we can turn to things like a public search engine, a distributed social media network, and think about how much larger communities might have some say in how some of these services are governed. And so, for example, you know, when it comes to a public search engine, in the book, I talk about the need for a much broader public conversation about how ranking algorithms operate. At the moment, something like Google's, you know, search function, the algorithms that it uses, we know a little bit about them, but the precise way in which they work is a closely guarded trade secret. It's, you know, seen as proprietary information, and rightly so by Google within the current system. But the fact that it affects billions of people across the world and determines the way and the structure, the way in which we access, you know, the world's information it's mad that we don't have more public knowledge of how this works. So I think a publicly operated search engine that made the algorithm available, that made it a subject of public debate is a central concern for our democratic government, right? Because something that is so important to how democracy functions, to how our civic lives are organized, you know, going back to that Republican language, if you want a global active citizenry and you want them to have access to information in an expedient and accessible way, well, the way in which that happens should be the subject of public debate. So too should social networks and social media be able to have some kind of, you know, community control involved. We can look to distributed platforms like Mastodon, for example, which has gained a lot of popularity in the wake of Elon Musk announcing that he's going to purchase Twitter. But we can see in you know, these kinds of alternatives that it might be a much, you know, a federated service of smaller communities or sub-communities that are able to talk to each other, but are able to use different servers. So they might set their own content moderation policies. And rather than having one big company controlling everything, you might see a variety of smaller providers giving people a lot of different options in terms of the free and open source software and the platforms that are developed on it, and the kinds of communities that you could be a part of while still maintaining contact with others. So you can see that I've kind of moved through a variety of different types of platforms at different levels. That's kind of like the practical, you know, core of the book, right? That it's like this theoretical contribution that links and draws on a lot of the debates that were happening in the early socialist movement and tries to find ways to translate that into some of our contemporary discussions about the digital economy. And I kind of make a series of theoretical contributions there, and then some practical examples and case studies of how we might see that today in terms of new structures for digital platforms.
Yeah, it's quite amazing. You go into the depth of the political thought of the 19th and 20th century. This debate reminds me a little bit of the comedy from Rowan Atkinson, this film Johnny English. It's like, it seems like the politics is always two steps behind, and the IT sector and the bad guy is an IT specialist, and yeah, it's like it reminds me of this debate that big tech and the big corporations are always one or two steps ahead of the game, and yeah, we are trying to to make a solution basically that passed already, and I remember, maybe I can phrase it, the quote I hear, a wonderful quote, that Google is not is now updating in this sense that in the past it told you what you should do now, and nowadays it will tell you what you do tomorrow, what you will do tomorrow. So it's like, I remember it from the Austrian philosopher Armen Avanessian. Yes, when I was talking to him, and I was looking up to his books, and he's saying that time changed. So big tech corporation, they changed the sphere of time, so to speak. They yeah, it's quite amazing. And on the other hand, you have this debate. For example, I listen when I was listening to the podcast of Joe Rogan, he invited Tristan Harris, for example, and he worked for Facebook, if I remember correctly. And there you have this insider talk about Facebook and about technology from the inside, so to speak. And they are also, so there is critique on the left side, there is critique on the libertarian side, there is also critique on from the inside as well. So where is, in your opinion, the weight, so to speak? Because as always, the left is not widespread enough, so to speak. So what do you think? Where is what is the mainstream critique of gig economy and digitalization, in your opinion? Left liberals, maybe?
Well, if you look at someone like Tristan Harris, and more recently Frances Haugen, who is another kind of Facebook insider turned critic, they're really, I would call Tristan Harris a humanist critic, because his fundamental point is that big tech undermines our autonomy by somehow hijacking our brains, right? By subverting or circumventing our usual decision-making processes, by finding ways to nudge us, to gently push us, and to direct us towards behavior that's desirable for the company. And it's about the way in which some of these companies drew upon social psychology literature, essentially, to find ways to condition human behavior and, increase engagement with the platform. So they would ask questions about what kind of a post, is going to keep people on the platform. What does it have to say? What discourse would it have? Is it going to be images or words? Is it going to be something you love or something that you loathe? And through rigorous research and a lot of trial and error, these companies really honed in on just how they can get people to, engage with the platform and to maximize the time that they spent on it and the amount of replies and likes and new friends that they added. So I think this is an interesting angle. It tells us most about questions around social media addiction, around political polarization, perhaps misinformation spreading as well. But the solutions that are offered are often within the very framework and the very worldview that created the problems in the first place, right? The thing about Tristan Harris is that, and a lot of these insider turned critics is they're the very people who created the problems. And you might say, well, this gives them such a great vantage point to diagnose it. They know everything, they've been there. But at the same time, if you look at the solutions they're offering, and the path that they say that we should go down. And this is the same as Frances Haugen, right? It's more of the same. It's tech with a human face, or a slightly more humanist view on tech. We just need a few bad eggs removed. We need a more ethical CEO. They don't, because their entire worldview is shaped by that, they don't know how to think outside it. So one of the things I wanted to do from when writing this book was, rather than having yet another tech executive who wanted a slight career change, or who wanted to start their own Tech for Good NGO and wanted to get a bit of publicity around it, I wanted to give the perspective of an outsider, someone who has been studying the workers' movement for the past 5 or 10 years and thinking about how we can bring some of these debates to some of the questions that we face today. And so it was really about thinking about how we can have a very different question, a very different perspective that starts from concerns about political economy, that starts from a structural analysis of the sector and of what constraints and what incentives these companies face in data markets, and thinking about how we can fashion solutions based on that. And so it really calls for a much stronger intervention and more radical and more far-reaching reforms as to what needs to be done, right? Because I think it's very hard for people who've grown up within these companies and within this kind of very limited Silicon Valley design thinking world, in which people, seemingly don't read any history or read much at all. I think it's important to have a slightly different perspective as well. So that's kind of one of the contributions I wanted to make in writing this book. I think there's a lot of other really great stuff out there as well that's come before it. But yeah, that's kind of, I think that's the kind of, and if you think about like what the dominant critique of that is, you could also turn to perhaps the kind of antitrust or anti-monopoly critics, who I have a lot more time for than the Tristan Harrises of the world, right? Because I think they do start to grapple with some of the structural problems with industry, and draw on the US history of antitrust thinking in interesting ways. I think there are some limitations with how that works in practice. So, for example, if you turn to Elizabeth Warren's campaign slogan of breaking up big tech, and she's been very vocal recently with Elon Musk buying Twitter, I think like in practice, it would be very difficult to know how you would break up big tech. You might want to unwind some of the mergers. So, for example, Facebook purchasing Instagram or WhatsApp, but you can't really see Facebook being broken up into 10 different social networks, or how that would work in practice. Because really, when we talk about breaking up large companies, that's kind of the historical example that we've got, right? Of Standard Oil in the early 20th century and the American telecommunications platforms in the 1980s. The solution was creating a Pacific, oil company and a Midwest oil company and blah, blah, blah. And so that's not going to work. So what do you actually mean by breaking up big tech? And I think another issue here is, unlike the kind of utilities infrastructure that we see with like phones or water lines or gas lines, social media operates differently. There's no real reason why a smaller or a small to medium-sized social media company wouldn't operate using the exact same strategies that Facebook has, right? Because they are facing structural constraints to maximize user engagement, to maximize profits. If they're a publicly listed company that are beholden to shareholder interests, then they need to maximize user engagement. That's how you make money, right? If you are an advertising platform, you make money by getting the most number of people and selling the most number of ads. And if you can keep doing that, then your future is looking good. The issue here is that we allowed essential communication infrastructure to be run by for-profit companies, rather than seeing it as a public good, right? As a public utility that we should invest in, so that people had free access to a reliable service that they could use to improve their lives and to do all kinds of important and interesting things. So I think the problem really at the heart of this that platform socialism diagnoses is that we now live in a world in which the digital town square, the means by which we communicate, a whole host of other digital services are run as for-profit companies. And I think that's the problem, and that's where we need to look to for a different ownership and governance structure.
Yeah, what I find very useful, and here we are on the same page, is, for example, in my opinion, there is this false dichotomy, or this false solution. Either you run all by the state, so this is the state-run companies, and the state owns it and controls it, or you have this neoliberal sort of or stakeholder economy, the dream of Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum. So in here you intervene, so to speak, and here you say, okay, but there is a third way, and yeah, this is what is quite important, because like the problems are clear. I mean, the Netflix series, for example, the Netflix documentary Social Dilemma went viral. So the problems are obvious, and many scholars and professors and experts on media and digitalization, automatization, and so on, and so on. Yeah, they are talking about this. So the problem is not new, so to speak.
Absolutely.
But the solution is the problem. The problem is clear, and I heard your podcasts and the time you are being on different shows, and you always mention this, that left wings tend to write 8 chapters on, okay, what is going wrong in the world, and about the problems, and just one tiny chapter on, okay, what might be one sort of solution, semi-solution. So yeah, it's always the same.
Yeah, this is the typical Verso book. You have 5 chapters on everything that's wrong with the world, and then a very thin sketch of what could be better in the final chapter.
Yeah. On the other hand, a whole big narrative to give the people a big picture is also not, for example, a 5 years plan, or it's also problematic. So I believe we have to get used to the unknown and embrace the unknown. Yeah. So we talked about the problems of algorithms and a little bit of gig economy. There is also, because we mentioned left liberal critique of monopolizing, of monopolization and so on and so forth, but there is also a right-wing critique. There's also many conspiracy theories in regard to the Great Reset and so on and so forth, and they take the discourse of the World Economic Forum in order to say, okay, there is this big conspiracy. And I talked to Dr. Ngai Ling Sum, and she's also very interested in this whole discourse, and she works with Foucault and Gramsci, and we talked also on this platform VIPR on this, and we discussed the thing. Is this kind of maybe this is a conspiracy theory, that the big tech is creating this kind of conspiracy theories in order to make this chaos, or I cannot explain how people can be so I have to be polite, but how can you believe in such things, and what is the, you know what I mean, this right-wing rhetoric against digitalization and so on and so forth, in my opinion, is very counterproductive, because and also I see it in my bubble, in my left-wing bubble. For example, there are anarchists, green anarchists, anarcho-primitivism it's called, that we have to abolish all computers and phones and so on and so forth, and so they demonize technology, but this is also not the right way. So we can find some critique that is unproductive or counterproductive on both spectrum, in the spectrum, and on the political left and on the political right. So what's your opinion on that?
So I think the big critique that conservatives have of Silicon Valley and digital platforms is that there is a left-leaning bias in how the platforms are moderated. And so it intersects with debates around free speech, around culture wars, around wokeness or quote unquote wokeness, critical race theory, children and university students getting brainwashed by a left-wing dogma. I think much like the kind of conservative critique of Hollywood, Silicon Valley is also kind of seen in a very similar way. That it's full of progressives who are systematically trying to marginalize conservative voices. And it's kind of ironic that they think that, because the left's main problem is that, like, the opposite, right? That they also feel silenced and marginalized by Silicon Valley, and that actually Silicon Valley is full of like right-wing libertarian billionaire nut jobs. I think it's probably, it's important to recognize that this is a very real force, that many people do sincerely hold these beliefs, and the part of the overlap of some of these critics is the fact that they agree that Silicon Valley has too much power, right? And it's just a question of, well, who should have the power and how should it be exercised? And I think it's important to try and find some common ground with certain other camps, obviously not with the kind of extremist, white flight, great, replacement theory types, but with people who have genuine concerns about who exercises power in society, about how platforms are governed, and to engage with these people and put forward the ideas that, maybe we should have more communities having greater control over this. We should be critical of how power is exercised and ask questions about it, and not assume that these large networks should just be run on the whims of these billionaires, however smart or rich and powerful they might be. It's kind of anti-democratic to have so much decision-making power in the hands of a single person. So I think there's some opportunity for engagement there, for dialogue, for even like kind of shifting people in a slightly different direction on some of these questions. I think that's a really important thing to do. But I think the main kind of concern that people like myself have is, well, what does that look like in practice? Because I think we need alternatives to some of these big tech platforms. I don't think that it's a matter of just, creating a new oversight board for Facebook. I don't think that's enough. I think we genuinely need free and open source software, publicly funded by governments or by foundations, that we need to invest serious money in these, counter hegemonic projects. And we need to convince people that we don't want essential digital services run by for-profit companies. We want more Wikipedias and less Googles of the world, essentially. We want more community and not-for-profit groups, more cooperative forms of social and economic production in these spaces, so that we can have these like genuine alternatives. Because I think the reform projects surrounding companies like Twitter and Facebook are just insufficient in and of themselves, and that really what we need is a kind of mass exodus and switch to alternatives. I think it can feel for some people like there is no alternative, like Facebook has always been and will always be, but it's just ridiculous to think that these companies that have only been around for 10, 15 years are going to always be there, right? Before there was Facebook, there was MySpace, and now there aren't that many people on MySpace, and in a few years there aren't going to be that many people on Facebook. And so we need to think about what will replace it when that will inevitably happen, right? And we just want to make sure that we start laying the groundwork for better alternatives to come.
And also, I can can see the spirit of Rosa Luxemburg in your work, because you have this like I believe she said this radical reformism. So it's both. It's like on the outside and on the inside you have to work bottom up and top down. So both at the same time. And in this sense, you give us some solution in your books and your political philosophy. For example, on a larger scale, you speak about institutions like ELO in regards to digital institution that regulate and do these things. So what kind of solutions we can put forward? Yeah.
Well, I've kind of given a little sketch of some of the examples. The example that I give at the international level is quite a kind of speculative and big picture kind of project. Just because you mentioned the ILO just then, I talk about the possibility of creating a global digital services organization. Now, this is just one example of the kind of system we might want to have. The principle here is that, well, it would be good to have a kind of new agency that is responsible, perhaps associated with the UN in the same way that the ILO is, that's responsible for thinking about how essential digital services could be structured and developed and funded, just as in the same way that questions of international labor and communications and other services have kind of built up these agencies and organizations around them. It's really only been in the past 20 or 30 years that we've realized just how essential this whole sphere is for humanity's development. And so I don't think it's out of the question at all that we should prioritize this through a new organization in this respect, because it creates a center of power that's not in Silicon Valley. It creates a new international structure that enables a much broader range of voices to have its say in how it would be developed and funded. It could begin by a kind of small levy on any of the digital companies that kind of earned or had a market capitalization over a certain threshold. And it could be funded by state contributions kind of moving forward, because, one of the aims would be to reduce the power and the size of these big tech companies by creating alternative services. But I think, as like fantastical as coming up with new organizations out of the blue might be, I think it does answer some of the really big questions that are kind of plaguing this alternative digital network space. Because one of the things it does is it creates this huge possible source of funding for free and open source software to develop, for this organization to fund developers, to fund creatives, to basically create this huge thriving ecosystem of free software that gets developed, that the code gets put up online, that people can build on, can replicate, can do their own things with. Because I think the fundamental issue that people have in this space is it doesn't have enough funding. And the alternatives that we have in the Fediverse, for example, or some other small scale alternatives are usually done by one or two people or a very small team of people, usually as a side project. They might have another full-time job. They might be doing other things. And so they're just not going to develop the same kinds of user experience as the big corporate platforms. They're going to have more bugs. They're going to have less capacity to adapt, to scale up, to take on larger numbers of users. But the more effort and the more time and the more energy and money we see invested in this space, I think the better the products will be, and the more people will get behind them, right? So it might shift from being a rather fringe and niche movement into something that could genuinely be as popular as something like Wikipedia is. Because I think we shouldn't sell ourselves short, right? There are really good examples in the digital space for not-for-profit based software, for public funding, and for the free and open source software movement. There are lots of issues and problematic case studies, but there are some very shining exemplary services out there. And so that's really promising to see. And I think we can look to that to develop it even further still.
I totally agree. And yeah, hopefully it will work someday. What I asked myself is, because we talked about platforms and so on and so forth. In my opinion, I see the danger of, because capitalism has this ability to change the face, and to and to adapt to certain crisis and to use the crisis for its own benefits, so to speak. So and in that sense, I see, for example, because I do some research in this field, for example, the European Union does have some digitalization projects and fundings and so on and so forth. And the whole agenda is in the spirit of the stakeholder economy, and the whole discourse is very neoliberal. And so in my, I have this fear, because you all talked also about participatory society and to maximize the participation and so on and so forth. Once you talked about Carole Pateman as well. Here I see the big danger also, because for example, in one lecture, Professor Oliver Machat talked about, he observed this kind of new public management, and this new, that companies and their rhetoric and their democratic tools for yeah, they how can I say, it's like corporations without hierarchy, but in like work for us, feel good, do your job, this kind of neoliberal exploit, like Foucault did, put it like governmentality, and it's basically like this. And so my fear is that all what we talked about and all this concepts could also be used very easily from neoliberals. Do you agree with my fear? Is it rational?
I understand where you're coming from, and I think it has a very good point to say. In the book, I give a very in-depth critique of stakeholder capitalism, for example, because I do think that corporations like Meta, or previously Facebook, or Airbnb, do engage in what I call community washing, which is to say they mobilize this rhetoric around a social enterprise and community building as a way of covering over the extractive nature of their business models. So I think they're definitely at the forefront of this latest movement of stakeholder capitalism, of trying to appear as these cuddly, lovable social enterprise, community first kinds of platforms that are just trying to do their bit to build global community and make the world a better place and solve our most pressing problems. I'll turn to, part of what you were talking about really was referring to Boltanski and Chiapello's book, French book called The New Spirit of Capitalism, right? You're really within that kind of framework. And what they saw in the new public management discourse of the 1990s was that a new generation of entrepreneurs and capitalists sought to mobilize the rhetoric and the language of the 1960s and 70s social movements as a way of rebranding capitalism as fun, as liberatory, as potentially able to maximize people's own sense of desire and pleasure. You didn't have a boss, you have a pool table in your thing, you play table tennis at lunchtime, your boss wears jeans and a t-shirt. This is obviously part of the kind of Silicon Valley mindset, right? Or it's been adopted within the Californian ideology. What was once first identified, I think the empirical work for that was done in the 90s in France, right? It was French managers, right? The soixante-huitards who had become grown up and become corporate and sold out, as we all will one day. But so I think the issue here and what they say is that, and this is a really important part and why I think it's important to maintain a critical edge, it's the new public management discourse was able to incorporate an aesthetic critique of capitalism by disowning and disallowing what they call the social critique, right? So they sideline concerns of justice and economic inequalities, and they take on all these, aesthetic ideas, freedom, desire, being your own boss, autonomy. And so what I think is really essential, both about platform socialism, but about any meaningful critique of the platform economy and platform business models, is that we are attentive to questions of power, ownership, and control. As I said at the beginning, that we center concerns around, well, who is making money and how are they doing it? And who's benefiting from this? Who has control over this? What kinds of democratic institutions would we have over the platform that would enable us to have genuine decision-making power at key moments in how the company or the cooperative was structured and governed? And how would we have a political economy in these digital markets that means we can rely on public funding to fund essential services, while at the same time ensuring that people aren't going to be exploited in these through very, terrible forms of wage labor, but also of gig economy work, right? Where you just get paid per delivery or per whatever, that you have no security, you have no perhaps no employment rights, that these kinds of things would need to be taken out of the picture as well as thinking about questions around ownership structure. So I think that kind of, so that being said, I think the answer to your question is, yes, they are susceptible to being perverted. And I think we do see a lot of this. And another case study, I think, is the discourse around Web3, if you're familiar with that. So these questions about decentralizing the internet through creating Bitcoin and digital token-based communities, that a lot of these use the language of community ownership and, taking back the internet. But if you look at the major players behind it, it's a lot of the same venture capitalists who funded the original social media companies to begin with, or new players who want to make some money through a new decentralized form of finance and through Bitcoin and other digital currencies. So I think, yes, it is susceptible to being co-opted, but I think we need to be clear precisely about what the alternatives are and what makes them meaningful alternatives, so that when other things do crop up, we can say, aha, that's not what we're talking about. This, it has to be like this. We want examples that look like real social ownership, that aren't extractive, hierarchical business models, but that are giving people genuine free alternatives.
Yeah. Because you also spoke about the guilds and the medieval guilds and this kind of business model or association, call it as you wish. And I ask myself, is it, can we draw a parallel to anarcho-syndicalism, for example, in Yugoslavia, or for example, the type of syndicalism that Noam Chomsky also writes about, and this whole anarchism and tradition of self-management, self-governing, self-determination, and yeah.
Yeah, I think, well, you mentioned quite a few different a few different deviant forms of leftism, basically. So the Yugoslav self-management worker model, anarcho-syndicalism is obviously kind of its own kettle of fish. You've got Chomsky's kind of federalist kind of anarchism that he's talked about from time to time. And another thing you mentioned was Guild Socialism. So figures like G.D.H. Cole and others around the British labor movement in the kind of 1910s and 20s. And it was really the latter that was most formative on the theoretical structure of this book, of platform socialism. It's not so much the medieval guilds themselves. I think that's a little bit of a misnomer. The way in which G.D.H. Cole, who's a kind of member of the Fabian Society and a critic of some of its more bureaucratic and centralizing tendencies, the way he saw guild socialism was about this question of how do you democratize a series of associations that are so important to your everyday life? Things like your workplace, your perhaps university, school, sporting association, public institutions, art, culture institutions. What was that?
Money as well.
Financial institutions, regulatory bodies. I mean, his real theory is about decentering the position of the nation state as the kind of central coordinating apparatus and empowering a series of producer, consumer, and municipal associations to play a much greater role in governing everyday life. And it's this vision of a guild society that I think is still a powerful exemplar of how you democratize democracy, which is to say, how do you spread democratic principles to a much broader array of social institutions that are really important for your everyday life. And I essentially try to turn to digital platforms to think about how we can democratize the platform by applying some of these principles that were developed by Cole and others, and were a kind of variant of libertarian socialism that you could put alongside some of those other tendencies that you've just mentioned there. And obviously everyone has their own kind of historical journey and trajectory that they take to get to where they are. And so I'm sure there are interesting and important things that you might take from various strands of anarchism as well. And Cole himself was often seen as a kind of a little bit of an anarchist, that he had a kind of anarchist heart. And he certainly, is critical of some of the more centralist strands within Marxism and within the British Labour Party. So you could definitely, he has some nice things to say, I think, about Bakunin and Proudhon at one point, and Rousseau, of course, as well.
Yeah. So our journey leads us to your field of research on the German council movements and the council democracy. It's also linked to your books and so on and so forth. For example, in your book, Building Power to Change the World, the political thought of German council movement, in the introduction, it was to reading this, it's like I draw almost in a second the parallel to today's crisis, climate crisis, economic crisis, and so on and so forth, austerity politics, neoliberalism, the war not only in the Ukraine, the Turkish invasion of Kurdistan, of northern Syria, that is happening in these days, and many other crises and geopolitical tensions, and And you said in the introduction, during the chaos and political unrest of the First World War, council movements arose across Europe through soldier mutinies and mass strikes and factory occupations. And there you describe this whole, how the movement and, so to speak, this revolutionary committee's response in the interests of the lower classes. And I draw this parallel, maybe you disagree, but I have to ask you, can we see some parallels to nowadays? And maybe the more important question is this an opening for us to put forward to democratize democracy, to realize this old tradition of council democracy?
Well, it's a big question, right? So I think what we've seen is that moments of crisis and transition are these perfect opportunities for different groups to put forward new, bold ideas, right? One of the biggest changes that we've seen in terms of socioeconomic structures was, during the late 70s and 80s with the global oil crisis, some of the perceived failures of the welfare state and Keynesian economics, and the transition to kind of Thatcher and Reagan world, to privatization, to liberalization, to opening, various countries up to global trade. And I think this is all possible because of a perceived moment of crisis. And what we see today in the tech world is really a dramatic turning point in the digital economy. We see a series of legacy companies reaching a certain turning point, right? Late last year, Facebook for the first time stopped growing, right? Its monthly users decreased for the first time ever. It was seen to be such an important turning point that the entire structure of the company kind of needed to be changed, right? That this perception that Facebook was not getting younger audiences anymore, that it had almost reached 3 billion users, that there might not be that many people that it could connect. it has shifted $10 billion worth of its resources into what has essentially been a huge loss-making venture. The Oculus headsets, the software around the metaverse, a new line of products that Mark Zuckerberg hopes will replace mobile phones as the kind of primary communication and connection device with the internet and with others. So Facebook is undergoing a huge turn. At the same time, in global tech's response to the pandemic, you saw this incredible increase in people's use of technology. It was like 10 years of transition happened in a matter of months. Tech profits soared. Some of the tech companies, went up 40%. They were responsible, single-handedly responsible for keeping the stock market afloat at a time that most of the other parts of the economy were stagnating, aside from pharmaceuticals, of course, with the pandemic. And so it's this, incredible time of transition. At the same time, you have all of these new competitors and people that are seeking to create new companies and new enterprises, trying to pry open the doors to different types of business models and different different competitors that can come into the market. And so is a lot going on. Everyone sees it as the end of, Web 2.0, or at least a transitionary era where something new is emerging, but we're just not sure what that is. Is it Web 3? Is it metaverse? Is it probably neither of those things, to be honest? But that was what we were talking about in 2021. But, at this moment of turning point, at this moment of crisis where people feel like technology is no longer delivering on its promise of solving the world's most important problems and helping us become better people, this is the moment is right for alternatives, right? So I think what we should be doing is pushing forward these alternatives of, trying to get as much funding as we can to them, of talking about them, of helping them solve various problems that they're facing, trying to grow their user bases, trying to get people interested in this, to put the case that it's not just reforms, but alternatives that we need. And I think this is, it would have been better in the 2010s, but there's no time like the present. Yeah, so
yeah,
I think that's good.
And my last question is related also to this Council of Democracy. I'm a big fan of this concept. I'm a big fan of Rosa Luxemburg and Gustav Landauer. And you also mentioned a lot this Austrian philosopher, I believe it.
Yeah, Otto Neurath.
Otto Neurath, yes.
Yeah.
And so let's talk about the principle of subsidiarity and because Rachel Süß mentioned in one of your book launches, she talked about that size and scale in your book is very important, and it because she's a political theorist as you, it has a very crucial and important impact on democracy. So let's talk about scale and size and this principle of subsidiarity.
Okay, I can talk about subsidiarity. So there were a few other names mentioned there. I will just briefly say that Otto Neurath is a very influential figure for me and for my work because of his insistence on the question of democratic planning and public planning. And how do you think about ways in which, outside of certain market mechanisms and outside of the private ownership of investment capital, how do you think about long-term planning in an economy, right? I think this question is coming back in through the back door for a lot of people, right? People who might not necessarily have thought themselves as particularly socialist or left-wing minded, but when we're facing global questions and global problems such as the pandemic, the climate crisis, international war, suddenly these questions seem much more urgent and much more relevant for us than ever before. So I think Otto Neurath is a really important figure there. So I would encourage people to kind of chase up that reference and to do a bit of reading on their own. Obviously, it's got a great introduction in my book, Platform Socialism. So start there, get that book, and then go read something else. But something else that you mentioned, Rahel Zeus has said that, scale and size is very important to the project. And I think that's correct. What I mean when I say we need an alternative ecosystem of different ownership models is that depending partly on the size and the scale of the service, it should be governed by different sizes of communities. And the principle of subsidiarity means that a platform should be governed at the lowest scale that it could be done so in an effective and sustainable way. So this is based on the idea that democracy works best at a kind of local level, that when you can have either face-to-face or personal deliberations with people, that there is something essential about how democracy works in this kind of deliberative paradigm. And most of our interactions in our everyday life are with people that we spend, we know personally, we spend some time with, we have an idea of what their interests are, what they're like, and that many of our platforms should also operate in that way. Now, it's a principle of subsidiarity because it's not going to effectively work at every scale, every level, that we need to look where we can to the local, but also be prepared to institute forms of democratic control at higher levels as well. And so we look to the function that the platform performs, and then we organize the nature of the community that owns and operates the platform on the basis of that function.
And it's also important to mention your book, Council of Democracy. Let's be capitalistic for a moment, just for a moment, and mention your book, Council of Democracy, towards democratic socialist politics. There you have also this kind of history of minimal democracy, participatory democracy, radical democracy, agonistic democracy, deliberate democracy, and so on and so forth. So there you can also have this kind of political theory, and here you have also this worker councils, and between
I like the Council of Democracy book. That's honestly my favorite book. Because it's where I felt most alive. I felt most free when I was writing, because I knew it was so niche that I could say whatever I wanted and it wouldn't really matter that much.
Great. Because I'm a very curious person, I have to ask this. You wrote an article about Foucault's forgotten Hegelianism. And I know that this both guys would hate each other if they know each other. But
or if you read the article, I have some things to say about that.
So my question is, why suddenly they are friends? How you combine these two thinkers?
Well, I wouldn't say that they would be friends. I think the point of the article, I think I often get asked about, I think because it's such an unusual idea, right? It actually started as a joke because I was writing a book on Hegel. And so before my Council book, I did work on a book on Hegel's political philosophy. And we were reading a lot of French philosophy at the time and kind of had this joke. I think I joked that, if Hegel was alive today, he would be a Foucauldian. I think I said that to someone as a joke, that he would, have given up on the big system and just worked on this kind of historical genealogical method. And so from there, I kind of I was a student at the time, so we were prepared to write conference papers on jokes, basically. And I just kind of tried to uncover certain aspects of both of Foucault's own personal biography, but then of their philosophical projects in which there were these unusual points of alignment. And the real biographical detail that I think is fascinating is that Foucault wrote his master's thesis on Hegel under Jean Hippolyte, the famous French Hegelian, and has all these unusual references to Hippolyte and to Hegel throughout his work, particularly in the early stages, in the kind of 60s and early 70s. He kind of has these asides in some of his lectures and presentations where, he has this one moment where he talks about, Hegel, being at the start of a journey, and then we're trying to get away from him. And by the time we get to the end, we find Hegel waiting for us because he's kind of been there all along. And he talks about how indebted he is to certain aspects of Hippolyte's method. So I do think there are genuine points of, I don't think that they are kind of opposites. I know the idea is like, oh, one's this arch systemic thinker, the other one's this kind of like borderline nihilist, borderline, like subjectivist, who is very anti-systemic in certain aspects of his critical project. But at the same time, they both have a kind of, so I think there are certain parallels in terms of Foucault's genealogical method, that it's this patient laboring on our history to better understand who we are in the present. And so I think there are some interesting points of connection there in terms of the attention they pay to these historical methods where we're uncovering conflict and contradiction and missed opportunities and kind of random plays of force and clashes of ideas to better understand the production of historical subjectivity. And so there are moments at which there are clear departures, right? Obviously for Hegel, it's all part of this development of reason, in the unfolding of reason in the world. For Foucault, that's obviously absurd. But I think, would Foucault be a Hegelian today? That was the original paper, and I was just a student at the time, right? There's just some people just have funny ideas, and maybe we can just leave them at jokes. But if you're interested in the paper and some of these tensions or points of interest, definitely worth checking out.
Perfect. I thank you very much for this philosophical journey. I thank you much for your time and for this interview. And of course, we will put you in the info box, the YouTube channel, Autonomy,
Wonderful.
and your books and your Twitter account. So people can...
You've got to get Twitter in there. Need some more followers.
Of course. And so you can spread the word. So thank you very much for your time, and good luck with your projects, and good luck with the books and your research.
Yeah, thank you very much. Lovely being here.